invited by one of our disputa, who organize lectures and intellectual activities every so often, as well as having a lot of fun when we're not during usual Corona times. But so I will shortly hand over the word to the president of Dispute Gist, who organized today's lecture. And I hope you all thoroughly enjoy it. I just want to say before we start that if you have any questions to the speaker or which you'd like Arend Jan, the president of GIST, to ask, you can send them to me via the chat or send them in via the YouTube comments, and I will ask them for you, or at least I'll forward them through, sort them out, and if you've got any questions, just contact me. And yeah, without further adu, I'll hand over the word to Arend Jan.
Yes, thank you, Matthias. I'm very happy to take over the evening once again from you. I'm very happy that you let me. So tonight we're going to be talking about right-wing populism in Europe. In the past few decades, we spent a lot of time trying to explain the rise of populist movements in Europe and North America. More often than not, these explanations have focused on the rise of globalization, the influence of social media, or the migrant crisis in Europe. However, all of these explanations focus on the meta-narrative. They all accept populism in the European tradition as an undefinable movement, which is powered only by social and economic forces. But what if it's not? What if the populist movement we are seeing is not simply a random collection of policy ideals, but the birth of an entirely new ideology? And if that would be true, what would that ideology look like? And who are actually the people here in Europe who are trying to create it? So in order to talk about that tonight, we will be joined by Marijn Kruk. He is an author and journalist who has done extensive reporting in countries such as England, Austria, France, Hungary, and Italy concerning their populist nationalist movements and the crisis of liberalism that they face. He has written for Dutch publications such as Trouw, NRC Handelsblad, De Groene Amsterdammer, De Correspondent. And at the moment, he is a visiting fellow at the NIAS in Paris, from which he will be joining us live. His forthcoming book will focus on exactly the topic that we will be talking about tonight. He will talk to us about the role of the ideology factory in Budapest that is playing a central role in the creation of this new ideology. So without further ado, I would like to have a very loud internet applause for Mr. Marijn Kruk.
Well, thank you so much. I just have to correct on the introduction that I was at NIAS in Amsterdam, which is an institution actually based in Amsterdam, but now I'm just sitting in my very modest home in Paris. So, yeah. Can you hear me, Arend Jan?
Yes, I can.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, yeah. Thank you so much for having me. I'm so like in addition to what I just said about NIAS, I'm actually working on a book on the reporting that I did the last 2 years in Europe, and it's a book which is going to appear early next year at Prometheus, and so therefore, about Hungary, I just wanted to tell a little bit about how I came about to write about Hungary in the way I did, and what I mean is that I did not write about I wanted to write about the ideology, and not about the state of law, which has been a lot in the news, of course. And the reason actually is that I right next from where I live, I picked up here at the Métro Glacière here in Paris, I picked up a magazine which I follow because it's called L'Incorrect, and it's a French magazine which is close to Marion Maréchal Le Pen, on who I was doing a profile in that period, like 2 years ago, and it's it's sort of hipster looking magazine, but it's really radical right, and but it's really it's really good form thing. And they had a special, and like the special was called Le Soleil se lève à l'est, which is called, which you could like translate it as the sun rises from the east. And I thought that was an intriguing cover, and I started to read it, and it was like, and Hungary was set as Hungary was set as sort of as a sort of ideological example, and that intrigued me. So I called up the editor, who I know, and we sat down, and he explained to me that he dispatched a few reporters to Hungary to write about what he saw was happening, and was really interesting, and was really important also, that in Hungary there was a sort of new ideology being formed. It was not only, and it was sort of intriguing for me, because when I thought of Hungary, I thought of the state of law, which was undermined, about the press, on which was cracked down on like Orban, who was imposing himself as a sort of dictator. And so the fact that somebody could talk in a really positive way about Hungary and Orban intrigued me. And then I sort of, and like in the same time, well, and of course it was also sort of irony, because before, in the 70s, for example, it was the French radical left which moved, well, like, who looked to China, for example. You had this magazine called like Tel Quel, with people with writers like Julie Kristeva and Philip Sollers, and they would look to China, and they would say the sun is rising from the east, but now there was another sun rising from the east. And so it intrigued me, and I decided to go there, to Budapest and to Hungary, to try to speak to the people who were sort of who were like forming this ideology, and who were forming this policy also. And also I discovered that like Budapest was at the same time as it was also sort of pilgrimage place, where people from all over Europe would go to conferences there, who would go to live there. I spoke to a very intriguing like radical right person from the Netherlands, who actually started to live there from 2010, when Orban won his first big victory. And he explained to me, and he introduced me to all kinds of people who were like living in Budapest, because for them it was a sort of friendly environment. So I was intrigued by this idea of that, like Hungary and Budapest was a sort of safe space for the ultra-right in Europe. And I thought this was now, and I thought also this was an angle which was not really been written about. And because like as I said, it was all about the undermining of the state of law, and which is important, of course, and which is really worrisome. But it was something which I had been like described already, because I also was a correspondent in Turkey for a couple of years, from 2015 onwards. So I saw firsthand how Erdogan had undermined the whole democracy, the whole state of law in Turkey, how he cracked down on the press, on the opposition. And I knew where this was going, you know? So I was more interested in to describe the other reality behind it, which is also there in which is also there in Turkey, actually. I sort of wrote the same story, which I did in in Hungary for Turkey. So what is the ideological reality behind the whole crackdown and behind the power of Erdogan, which is also really fascinating, by the way. And so I decided to go there and to try to find people to speak to get to speak with government ministers, with ideologues, with journalists, all from the entourage of Orban. For a moment, I also tried to speak to Orban himself, which they would not firsthand exclude, but I think they did not trust me enough. It's interesting it was really interesting to win their trust, but maybe we're going to speak about it also. And so I sat down with all this, with 3 government ministers, with the president of of a big university, with journalists, with think tankers, and it was a and so I spoke with them, and I tried to, and I asked them all the time the same questions about, I wanted to try to understand that their ideological project. And what I found is that they were really sincere, they were really worried about Europe and about the future of Europe. And they saw two, like this, well, they described like two phenomena. The first was that like Europe was ruled by a decadent elite. And the second, that there were very conscious immigrants coming in, Muslims. And behind all this was, and like the driving force behind this was an ideology which was called liberalism. So they tried to formulate an alternative ideology, an alternative ideology, which they called illiberalism. And I basically learned that it could, like you all could cook it down to, it was sort of revolt against the revolution of 1968. It was there where they located a sort of, a sort of beginning of this whole process of decadence. And it was also, it all started with like, and I have to add, it was a cultural liberalism. So there would start for them like feminism, gay emancipation, anti-racism, the whole idea of the undermining of the undermining of authority of the father, but also of values, of the arts, of science, you know. So they like they wanted to formulate, to go against this and to formulate a sort of alternative ideology. But at the same time, they saw that they thought it was already too late for the Western Europe, because like multiculturalism was already so dominant, and there were like already too many immigrants there, and the elites were so corrupt and so decadent that it was already too late. And that's why they saw themselves as a sort of, as the keeper of the original European soul. And so this idea of was really attracting, and I thought like this was the core idea of, like, this is sort of the driving idea of the Orban government in a cultural sense. At the same time, it's sort of also it started out because they would critique also like economic liberalism, but at the same time it's quite hypocritical, because they are very capitalistic. There is a crony capitalism. There's a market liberalism in Hungary, which is quite rude, which is quite brutal. So this is, this is something. But about the cultural liberalism and the whole critique, what I found intriguing also is that I wonder in what way it is really, they saw themselves also as like, because they were behind the Iron Curtain, that this whole liberal revolution of '68 could not go behind there, and so so these countries had to gain sort of purity, a sort of cultural purity, and but at the same time, I wonder whether this is really sustainable, because if you look at polls and you see that young people will subscribe to this Western values and these values of '68 in a sense, while you see that so this would really this makes me really reserved in the way whether it is a really sustainable ideology actually. But we can talk about this, of course, and so this would be a sort of short introduction to what I try to do in Hungary, actually.
Yeah, thank you. So for the rest of the night, I will be asking some questions that I've prepared, but it's also very nice to have a lot of questions that you guys in the audience have. If you have any, please send them to Matthias through the Zoom chat. I do not know how it works for the YouTube people, but I suppose Matthias just maintains an eye on that chat as well. The first subject we will be talking about is what you already mentioned, more the journalistic aspect of it, how you got into contact and how that contact would go. After that, we will be talking more about who these people are, the network of, well, as you said, more alt-right think tanks and individuals who have positioned themselves in Budapest and the ideas that they actually have. And then lastly, we will talk about how this network has an influence on the rest of European politics, not just limited to what we might consider right-wing populist parties. So if you have any questions about that, send them in, and I'll try to put them in at the right moment. So to start with, you mentioned already that you luckily got a way into this community, but I wonder, how was that first contact with these people? How willing and easy were they with talking with you?
Well, there were some, I got some different angles because, of course, I got to speak with really some hardline alt-right people, of course, but also with government ministers, which is not the same, of course. And but I think I basically tried to be really honest and sincere, and I tried to show that I knew what I was talking about. And for example, I studied like political philosophy in Paris with quite a conservative professor, and he's quite known. His name is Pierre Manon, and he's quite known in conservative circles actually. So I would just drop his name, and I would try to win the confidence of these people. And like once, and like I had the mobile number of the president of this university, and I just called him up and he answered, and then he invited me to come to his office, and then he would tell me that he would never, if I would have tried to make an appointment with him, he would never allow me. But just the fact that I called him up he was sort of bluffed, and he said, okay, come then. And then with him, I could just, it was sort of like, I could say to other people, I talked to this guy, and then you can just add up. And so, yeah, but I have to say it's quite rare because people in the Orban government, they really rarely talk to journalists. They never talk to correspondents in Budapest. But I don't know. I was quite sincere. I told them I was working for the Groene Amsterdammer, which is, of course, a leftist liberal magazine, and I was really open about it. But I sort of made clear that I was really sincere in taking ideas seriously, and I think that was important because everybody wants to be also understood and wants to be taken seriously by the other party, I think. And if you just, so this is what I did. I just took it really seriously, and
because I can imagine you talk about how you met with some people who are like French absolutist monarchists, or
yes.
people who are against the neo-fascist border almost. That's quite a way out of like a comfort zone for at least normal people.
Yeah. I don't know. I maybe it's I studied the counter-enlightenment ideas a lot. Like people of Joseph de Maistre, or these really radical thinkers from the 18th century, and so I know the ideas. I know the concepts, so I can show that I'm knowledgeable about the subject, and I think people appreciate it.
Mm-hmm.
Well, for example, like I also went to see Renaud Camus, he's he's this big conspiracy thinker, and he coined this sort of famous theory of the grand remplacement, and he lives in a big castle in in the south of France, and I went to see him, and I spent an afternoon with him. But he's also he's also looking for this recognition. You know, he's somebody who's keen on, and I sense this also with this more ideological minded ministers in the government movement, that they're keen on recognition, actually.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Did you ever feel that there would be kind of a moral charge there, then, that you as a journalist would go to these, well, what some people could say very fringe conspiracy theorists, though of course Camus with his Le Grand Lapensement has become quite a celebrity in Europe. But don't you think that there would be a bit of a moral hazard then for you as a journalist to go to and talk with these people and publish their ideas?
Yeah, well, there is, in a sense, that there is, of course, this critique of should you normalize their ideas, you know? And it's and I thought about it long. Well, because it's true that I published the interview with Camus in Trouw separately, but also in a critical way. But like, you have this idea of the Overton window. I don't know if you heard about this, but I think it's that just by putting ideas in the public space, you will sort of what is normal will sort of move through a sort of more to a radical point. But I don't know if that's really true. You know, it's at the same time. I was it's was I normalizing really dangerous idea? You know, was I normalizing dangerous ideas? I think not, because when people read the Groene Amsterdammer, they know what kind of publication it is, and I try to put the ideas in a frame, also in my article, that it was clear for the reader what it was. But at the same time, I wanted the reader to really feel and sort of to be convinced also by these ideas. Yes, I think that only in that sense you can really sense the force of ideas, you know, when you are sensing that you can also maybe believe them by yourself. So that was, but it's also, it was also for me, the challenge to write the piece, that I had to make a sense that people would sort of feel the potential of these ideas also in themselves, but at the same time, by reading my article, that I was not like making propaganda, you know, that it was clear what I was doing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I also think that if you read the article, that does become very clear, especially also with the interview you did with Renaud Camus.
Yeah.
But I would like to talk about those ideas that you mentioned. You already mentioned that there are some red lines going through almost all the people that you meet with, such as anti-globalism, national conservatism, the idea of the nation state and the family. And one idea in particular was very interesting, I thought, which was Orbans' notion of illiberalism, which apparently he also got some flag for in his own surroundings. Could you talk a bit about that?
Yeah, of course. I'm just to write. It's also really confusing, because there are two things going on at the same time. Because Orban is like being criticized that that he's undermining liberal democracy. Well, like there are two concepts of, and it's, I think it would it's sort of basically it's Orban's own fault. He was not really precise enough in what he was criticizing. Like Orban is not criticizing liberal democracy as such as we know it. You know, he's formally he is for pluralism. He doesn't want to he is for pluralism. He's for a free press. Formally, of course, he's criticizing. He thinks that liberal democracy has been hijacked by a radical idea of liberalism, which is this whole 68 ideology. At the same time, the reality in his own country is that the press is really having a difficult time. You see his people, his cronies are buying up big newspapers and then replace the whole redaction and replace all the journalists. There's big strain on the courts, of course. There's all kinds of he's working like the opposition has a really difficult time to make itself hear. So he's criticizing liberal democracy, but at the in a more ideological sense, but at the same time he's cracking down on it in a formal sense. So that is really confusing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there was another one of those concept twisting that I also read in your article, namely his idea of the European identity. Because the way you hear him and others in its circle ask and talk about how glorious European identity is, and even acknowledging its existence, you would assume that they have at least something positive to say about a European project. But that's not at all what they are going on about. Could you maybe speak about that, how their idea of European identity is a bit different than what most people might think of?
Well, of course, it's what you also see with other radical right-wing movements all over Europe. For example, with like Thierry Baudet, that when he says, for example, I detest the European Union, but I love Europe. I think like it's the same sort of like rhetoric that their idea of a European identity is a Christian. It's more based in an idea of Christian white supremacist idea of the identity. So you have a certain idea of purity. So there's this original white European people without the immigrants there, and of course without the Muslims. So this is much more identitarian idea of Europe than, of course, the European Union, which is seen as undermining of the nation state.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And in terms of that white supremacist tendency that that you see throughout these networks, there are sometimes also some hints of anti-Semitism. And most people, of course, think about Orban's war on George Soros. But could you talk about that and maybe also anti-Semitism in those networks a bit more in general?
Yes, this is also, I think it's multi-layered actually. Of course, you have this really raw anti-Semitism, of course, within right-wing, extreme right-wing movements, which is just all the old stereotypes. And at the same time, you have a really sophisticated anti-Semitism. For example, with the campaign against George Soros. And maybe it's interesting to tell that what happened, of course, in Hungary, that after the big win of Orban in 2010, he crushed all his enemies. Like he crushed the social democratic opposition. He crushed the left, and there were no enemies standing anymore. And he was advised by 2 American spin doctors, and they basically say, if we don't have an enemy, we have to create one. And then they sort of invented George Soros as an enemy to crush. But the whole irony of the thing was that the two PR advisors who were advising him were themselves Jewish, and they were recommended to Orban by Netanyahu, who is the prime minister, of course, of Israel, which is the Jewish state. So, and then it resulted in a really nasty campaign, which sort of confirmed all the stereotypes of anti-Semitism, with like a Jewish man who is like well, like who is posing like himself as a sort of puppet master who is in finance, who is trying to influence in a sort of creepy way, you know. And so it was really confirming all the stereotypes of the old anti-Semitism trope. So it's really, but the whole campaign was well, but like this whole campaign was like designed by two Jewish spin doctors. So there were all things, yeah. So it's really confusing, you know. So, but what I think is that like you have this whole idea of globalism, and you have this idea of like Davos, you know, like the people who fly there and they form a sort of elite who is governing the world. And this is, of course, an old anti-Semitism, well, an old anti-Semitic trope, of course. Like you have this sort of Jewish conspiracy of rich financiers who are governing the world and who are behind everything and like putting the ropes and but it sort of has and in that sense it has sort of lost its specific Jewish substance, except for the fact that Soros, of course, is a Jew. So that makes it really complex. But of course, I think in Hungary, Orban knows exactly who to address, because there is a lot of anti-Semitism in Hungary, especially with the extreme right and the Jobbik party. So he knows what he's doing, and he knows what he's doing, and he's doing it really, really shrewdly.
Yeah, to add on to that, we have a question from one of our listeners, one of our viewers, Hidde Luchtenbelt. He asks, do you expect other European illiberals looking at the East will also start to create a Nemesis narrative like Orban has with Soros?
Well, we have observed this because like Thierry Baudet is trying to do it all the time. He has like I think he has tried to verdacht maken, how do you say it? To
make conspicuous?
Yes, he has tried to make conspicuous Soros, you know. He was like, just last week he was trying to undermine the whole idea of the election by sort of taking over the whole Trump idea that the election was stolen. And so, and you see that everywhere. Matteo Salvini is doing this, Nigel Farage is doing this, Marine Le Pen is doing this. Yeah, of course, yeah.
Yeah, we have some questions about the Hungarian political situation more in general. So maybe let's add those in too. We have one from Maarten Lemstra, who asked, it's hard to find out how many people are a member of Fidesz. Is membership to the party made conditional on any particular benefits or advantages? Or are they getting advantages through the crony capitalism you mentioned? Do you perhaps know that?
No, I don't really know. I have not, no, I've not, I just don't know. I focused on other things, not on really the specifics of the Fidesz party. But
Mm-hmm.
but what I don't know. I prefer not to answer the question than answer the question falsely.
Yeah, I get that. Yeah. Let's maybe get to the other topic then. You mentioned earlier that you spoke with Renaud Camus, and he's mostly known here in the Netherlands for his The Great Replacement Theory, or omvolkering, as it's called in Dutch, mostly because some members of, for example, the PVV party have spoken about it in parliament. Now, this is, of course, a huge conspiracy theory, and the most pure form that we would call it. How do you feel is the influence of conspiracy thinking in general in the movement? Is it as prevalent as, for example, Camus' Grand Remplacement everywhere, or is this more of an exception?
Yeah, that's a good question, because it poses the question of cynicism, of course, within the leadership of these movements. I think there's a lot of cynicism. I don't think that Orban truly believes that there is a conspiracy of leaders getting in immigrants from Arab countries to replace the white Christian population. So there's a lot of cynicism on the one hand. At the same time, there is a lot of conspiracy, because if you only for France, there were, I don't know how it is now, but a couple of years ago, there was there was an opinion poll. And I think that nearly about like 47% of the French believed that there was some form of grand remplacement, which is huge, of course. And then you also have to know that, of course, in the election of 2017 here in France, just over 50% of the French voters voted for anti-system parties. So I also think that it really the whole idea of, in the way that, or the degree that people believe in conspiracy theories, is also really closely related to the way people believe in institutions, actually, like the elections, like the judges, like the press, and in France, as I know, it's really, really low. But I think there is a connection. There's an but yeah, it's I think it's just the fact that it is sort of, if you see that a lot of people believe or if they are just open to conspiracy theories, that you see there's a lot of political capital to gain. And you saw it also with the yellow movement in with the gele hesjes, the yellow vest movement here in France. They were ventilating all kinds of conspiracies, like, and the most crazy one was that Macron, I think this was the time of the Marrakesh Pact, that it is not really, I think it's something that that the European Union engages itself of making more smoothly certain procedures and create more idea of a sort of state of law for, but like, but there was a conspiracy theory among the yellow vests, which was huge, that that Macron was selling a piece of France to the Arab countries so that they could bring out all kinds of immigrants to France, and they would sell it off. So and don't underestimate the role of social media, of course. I remember that I was 2 years ago, I was in the French countryside working for a Dutch broadcaster, and about pesticide. It was a whole other subject, but I was staying in an Airbnb of an English couple in the French countryside near Nantes, and they were isolated. They were in the countryside, and in the evening I started to talk to them, and they were completely radicalized. they were living in this beautiful house, you know, and beautiful area, and they were just watching YouTube all the time in Facebook, and they saw even more radical messages and films, and they sort of completely auto-radicalized. So yeah, I think social media is also really important there.
Mm-hmm. Maybe then there is that quite clear link between the people who are engaged in this network, who have already given up so much hope in the political and European institutions that then they are by definition more susceptible to these theories, for example.
Yes, I think, and I do think so, and I think it's really difficult to get them back. It's really difficult for established parties to get these people back, I think.
Yeah. And let's talk a bit about the influence that this political machine in Hungary has on like other right-wing political parties. We have seen, you already mentioned that in France, for example, there's quite a lot of discontent, which can sometimes be traced back a bit to that network. But do you have any direct examples of how specifically this network interacts with other right-wing parties throughout Europe?
Yeah, well, I think because like early this year you had a big conference in Rome where all these parties were like resembled, and where Orban was sort of where Orban was like treated as sort of the big hero, as the guest of honor, you know, and people would stand up and they would applaud him, and I don't think he has a really material influence on them, because basically Orban is the only one who is really in power. Well, of course you have Poland and you have another but at the moment there are no, in the west of Europe, there are no radical right-wing parties in power. But it's a sort of moral power he has over these movements, you know, because he is in power. He has a free hand. He has a 2/3 majority in parliament. He can say whatever he wants. He can do whatever he wants, basically. And of course he's sort of he's a hero for them, because he's sort of standing up to the European Union, which he's doing today, for example, with this refusal to sign this aid fund, and so he's cultivating this position, you know.
Mm-hmm.
Well, like the big example, I think the big moment, or like when he opened the eyes of the other radical movements in Europe, was of course with the immigration crisis of 2015, when he openly defied the EU, and he would not, he would put the fence there, and he would not take in one single refugee. So I think his influence is moral. It's ideological. Well, of course, it's ideological. So people would look to Orban and they would take over his talking points. But it's also moral, that he's standing there as a leader and he's doing whatever he wants, and that's
Mm-hmm. It was quite interesting. Not too long ago, I read in NRC a piece which was about the new party program of the right-wing SGP Christian Reform Party in the Netherlands, and they talked about how the revolution of 1968 had destroyed the inherent gender inequality on which Western society was based.
Yeah.
So not just these far right-wing parties, but also some other parties have taken it over. Have you seen other moments where this Orban's ideology was taken over also by just in general the political system, for example?
Yeah, well, actually it started with Sarkozy in 2007 in France. Actually, he won the campaign, I think. He was running against Ségolène Royal of the Parti Socialiste in 2007, and there was this big moment it was the last week of the campaign, and there was this runoff against Ségolène Royal, and it was quite close still. And he had this huge rally here in Paris, and he rented for, well, and he rented for 20 minutes against l'héritage de 68. And I thought it was really funny, but because it was so bizarre. But I think it really marked the moment, because I think this was the first time that that a political leader of the West was openly revolting so much against this revolution. And I think he was basically creating a sort of phantom enemy, because how can you fight a phenomenon which has been so entered the how would you call it, the bloedbaan,
the blood veins,
the veins of society. You know, it's like trying to undo the French Revolution in 1840. It's something which happened 50 years ago. Sarkozy was divorced 3 times. You know, he likes to party. Look at for example, Thierry Baudet. He's not somebody who lives up his principles. This I found one of the most puzzling and the most intriguing. Well, because it's not strange that a really fringe conservative party like the SGP, of course, is against all the individual liberties, which are among us, of course, the and all the emancipation. But at the same time, I think there's also a real, in more conservative layers of society, and for some part, I can understand why they. There's this idea that there was a radicalization, and it's not so much about the undoing of this revolution, but to sort of to temper it in a way that it would not take all over society. And then, you know, like where they talk now about in right-wing circles about like critical race theory, all this has been like all this has been like deduced on 68 and like the revolution of 68. So I think there's also I think like a small party of the SGP really wants to undo the right on abortion, etc., etc. But I think also there's a large potential among more conservative right-wing voters for sort of critique of this sort of cultural, well, like what they say, cultural Marxist movement, of course.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, so there is a potential. Yeah.
Yeah. We got another question from Bart van Tonselaar. He asks, in Poland, nationalism has been influenced by conservative Catholic ideals that make the Polish nation state an environment which rejects progressive values. This influence seems to result from their wartime history and subsequent Cold War developments. Were there similar dynamics or dynamics that had a similar effect in Hungary?
Yeah, that's a really good question, because not in that sense, because actually the Hungarian society, as like the Czechoslovakian society, is quite laïc, is quite secular actually. And even Orban, I think he was a Protestant who became a Catholic. And well, like people say that or the other way around. I'm a little hesitant now, but he made a reconversion, and people located his more conservative, identitarian conservative turn to this moment. But yeah, but it's not that strong, because I think Hungary is not a Catholic nation as Poland is that much. It's much more complicated. There's also a lot of Protestantism. I think the Catholics were also a minority for a long time. So they lack. But I think also, but it is an interesting point, because I think it makes Hungary more interesting because they're more flexible. What you see in Poland, for example, with Kaczynski, it's quite traditional, you know. It's just traditional Catholicism. It's not a new. They're not looking for a new ideology, or they just want to. Well, it's quite simple. They don't want gay marriage and they don't want abortion. It's quite the Catholic conservatism, you know. And in Hungary, it's much more complex. It's much more an identitarianism, and it's much more. It's a much more elaborated critique of the West, in a sense.
Mm-hmm. Would you say that the electorate in Hungary is then, in some sense, fundamentally different than electorates you can find elsewhere in, like, Eastern Europe, most especially, but also in Western Europe? Or is it just luck of the draw that it's Orban who is there and who is just such a gifted political grifter in that sense, that he can play the electorate?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and it's one of the things that I really it was also really revealing for me, because when I went to Hungary, I did not really know the history of Eastern Europe, and I made a stop in Vienna to meet Ivan Krastev. Maybe you've heard of him, but he wrote this really interesting book, The Light That Failed. Yeah, and it's really a different electorate, and in the sense that we should not underestimate the experience of Eastern Europe after the fall of the Berlin Wall, and there's this whole idea that there was this long period of imitation, and the idea that if the Eastern Europeans would just, well, there was only, when it happened, you know, the fall of the wall, there was only one idea on the market, which was liberalism. And so the idea was that if we just imitate the West, and if we just have their form of capitalism, everything will be fine. And of course, this was not the case at all. There was, well, at some point it worked, but there were huge effects like there was mass employment, of course, and there was also this feeling, which is sort of came in the years that come, of a sort of inferiority, you know, that they were feeling like they were imitating something, but they would never be more than a bad copy of the original, the West. So this was creating a sort of form of resentment, and Orban tapped into this resentment, and I think this really, or like even Krastev told me, that this really explains the huge success of Orban with this electorate, that he taps in a sort of resentment about a sentiment of inferiority, which has been felt for all over like Eastern Europe, of not being able to live up to the idea that they would imitate the West, you know, that they would always be a crappy copy of the West. So, and Orban, he promised that like Hungary could be itself and be proud.
Mm-hmm. To follow up on that then, considering that we're talking about the influence of Orban on right-wing populists in the rest of Europe, if Orban's rise in Hungary can be seen as like a specific outcome of that electorate, then to what extent do you think that if parties take over Orban's rhetoric with another electorate, such as, for example, in France or in the Netherlands, that even works then, because it's such a different electorate to which it's tuned.
That's true. But at the same time, that's true. At the same time, if you look, for example, at France, there's also a lot of resentment, and it's another resentment, but it sort of explains also why you could, I think, of course, it's true that you can't sell the same message to, but I think you can tap into this resentment, which Marine Le Pen obviously tries to. But I agree, it's different. Well, maybe you could see something with the Brexit. I don't know, that there was also this rhetoric or this myth that England would be a better version of itself, after the Brexit. They would go back to their glorified past of when they still had colonies, and they would sort of reinvent themselves as a country that glorious, but without the colonies, which would be like global Britain. So, but like this is more as a longing for something in the past. I don't think it really taps into resentment, but I agree that it's not the same message. But I think in that sense, the Hungarian case and the Poland case, they remain sort of case apart. They have to be treated as such also. It's a specific context.
Yeah, because more specifically then, to what extent do you think that it's actually possible to create such an alt-right-ish ideology which would actually work in multiple countries, for example? Not just the specifics, but more than just resentment or distrust of institutions.
Yeah. Well, I think basically, I think it would be impossible. I think that because I think what we see with maybe with immigration, because of course what we saw in 2015 was was a huge upsurge. There were like 1 million people coming, but it won't go that fast. But I think this I don't think that white supremacism is a sustainable ideology, in the sense that there's gonna be, if we like it or not, but there's gonna be a sort of mixité, these are trends we are not going to stop. Whether like people like Renaud Camus and also Geert Wilders, they are talking about remigration, but I really don't see how a country like France or how a country like the Netherlands is going to separate all the immigrants from each other and all the Muslims from the Christians and put them in a kind of if you like it or not, but we have to going to live with it, and so and that goes also, that goes for like immigration, but it goes also for the values, in a sense that I think that if you look at the big trends in the Western world, you see a trend versus like more individual liberty, more, and I don't see that easily how you can stop that. Even in Hungary, if you young people, they just go away, they like the country is emptying. It's a big problem for Orban. If he goes on with this policy, he will lose all the young people. They will just go to Germany. They will just go to Austria. So I don't think myself, it's really sustainable in that sense.
Mm-hmm. We had another question from Bart van Donslaar to add on to the idea that Hungary or Orban has to kind of accommodate these more younger, progressive citizens in order for them to actually stay in the country. He asks, further, is there space for anti-racism, queer and women's emancipation in the current conception of the Hungarian nation state?
Sorry, can you repeat the first half of the question?
Is there space for anti-racism, queer and women's emancipation in the current conception of the Hungarian nation state?
Well, not really. Of course, it is there in Budapest. Budapest has been changed to a green mayor now. But it's really difficult because, like, Orban is like just defunding university courses on these kinds of subjects. So they do everything in their power to prohibit that. So it's
As a final question and a more general question to end this part of it of the night on, it's a question from one of the people on the YouTube stream, Mercutio243. Do you think that European populists would come together and give a different view of European values? And could Orban be the person to lead this push?
Yeah, well, actually, they are trying, as we saw in Rome with the conference. They try to come together, but what you see also, and that's quite funny in the sense that their interests are really quite different often. For example, Orban, he really wants to stay in the European Union for two reasons, because he's getting a lot of money out of it, and it also enables like Hungarians from the neighboring countries, because like Hungary was, it's also a big trauma for Hungary, which has been exploited by Orban, of course. The Treaty of Trianon, and in that treaty, Hungary lost 2/3 of its territory. So, like, you have like millions of ethnic Hungarians living in surrounding countries like Serbia, for example, and Slovenia and Ukraine. And being in Schengen, being in the European Union, makes it easy for ethnic Hungarians to travel freely into Hungary. But that's only Hungary. So if you look to Italy, to Matteo Salvini, to the Germans, to France, all the populists have really all the national populists have often really different interests. So that makes it really difficult for them to work together, as you see also in the European Parliament. So that makes it really different for them they can agree on some common values, but it's been proven very difficult for them, as we saw with the last European election in 2019. That it's really difficult for them to agree on a common program.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. That's then the end for this part, I think. I think I'll give it back to Matthias then for now.
Thank you so much for answering our questions.
Yeah,
quite enjoyed it. I'll just pin myself as well. And yeah, I just wanted to say okay, like one final question from me as well.
Yeah.
So I know that Orban was historically part of the European People's Party, and that he had a lot of free reign because of that in the European Parliament. And so can he still use this to push his way around Europe? And does this change the way that the European Parliament is composed itself as well? Because you were just talking about conference in Rome, and like that there is a disjointed effort, but an effort nonetheless to push for European populists to unite. And I'm just still wondering, more so to go into this, do you think it will happen? Is there any real chance for such a populist coalition to occur?
Well, to start with your last question, I don't really think so, because that's really like the tragic of being a nationalist, that it's really difficult to to have a nationalist international. You know, it's you're focused on your own country, and your own country has a specific interest, and they're not collide with other. They're not really collide with other countries. So, for example, let me think of another. Yeah, well, maybe. Yeah, well, really, it really seems to me improbable that they would unite, actually. And well, they can unite, but for example, somebody like Orban would like unite more on values, you know, while for example Marine Le Pen is much more on economical issues also. So it really depends on the issues also. So I don't think there would be a big national populist international, and we have to see what happens, of course. But it's also my impression that sort of they've lost the momentum for the moment. Like in 2017, there was this really there was this big momentum with, of course, with or like 2015, you know, with like the immigration crisis, with Brexit, with Trump, and now it seems to stall a little, you know, and but at the same time, yeah.
It's just unlikely for the nationalists to unite, as you said.
Yeah, it really seems really paradoxical.
For sure, what you're saying does make sense to me in a way.
Yeah.
And on that note, I just wanted to ask finally, to end the night, let's say, most of us here are quite international in our mindset, quite globalist, if you will, since we're at the Dutch United Nations Student Association, and we have an interest in such matters. So on the average, I believe that the members of SIB and the students of Groningen are more progressive leaning, let's say. So I was wondering if you've got any final words for us, as someone who's written in the Groene Amsterdammer, and who has these perspectives on meeting and talking with people from all over the political spectrum. Whether you have any words for us on how to deal with this new upsurge of populist rhetoric and in the parties, as well in the Netherlands, as well as in Europe. Do you have any final remarks or pieces of advice for us?
Yeah, of course. I think, well, that's a good question, of course. I think I think it's really important to try to understand where these movements come from, and to not dismiss them on forehand, or to delegitimize or as like morally repulsive, or because often they make also good points. You know, you can also, liberalism has a problem, of course, with like with this whole idea of a sort of spiritual emptiness, and people, how you put it, but like a lot of people, they long for a certain sense in their life, for a certain idea of identity, and that goes also for the left in a sense, if it's more related to globalization. But it's important to have this idea of solidarity between the generations, between the classes, but also between the cities and the province. And I think that it's important to recognize that, especially as a more international, progressive people, that globalism is creating a lot of chances and opportunities, but it's also creating side effects which are important not to overlook. For example, if you look at the French deindustrialization process, which is huge, of course, but you can also look at, for example, at Eastern European countries, which for them it was like, for young people in Eastern Europe, it was a huge possibility to, or it was a huge huge possibility to go, well, to travel to the West and to study there and to work there. But at the same time, these people, well, like these countries got emptied, they got robbed of all their talent and their young people. So that created also sort of side effect, which have been maybe not always been taken into account. And I think it's really important for especially international minded progressive people to keep in mind what affects globalization, well, like what side effects the globalization can have, like it's really great to, like 10 years ago, everybody was talking about the internet and how great it was, and Facebook and Twitter. And now everybody's talking about like conspiracy theories, which are been which are spreading about the internet. So it's important, I think, to always keep in mind the complexity of the world, and to understand that the world will always be complex. Yeah.
So if I may surmise it, to always keep an open mind, to have empathy, to understand the other, and not to stick to your bubble, is what you're saying.
Yeah, and yes, and also maybe also try to remember that there's also always there might be a reality, there might be another reality which you don't see immediately on the surface, so keep an open mind for other sort of realities also. Yeah.
Thank you so much for those words. I'll keep that in mind myself for sure, and I hope the rest of the participants tonight will as well. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you for answering our questions. Thank you for your insights. Thank you, Arend Jan, and thank you to Gist for organizing this lecture. We thoroughly enjoyed it. A round of applause from myself and from the board and from everyone else here who's attending. With that, I'll just go into a few announcements, of course. But yeah, Marijn Kruk, if we were in person, I would send you, I would give you a gift, a bottle of wine and a wine opener, but sadly we can't do that because it's online. So I'll send you a gift of thanks after the lecture ends. Please. So thank you so much for attending. And if you'd like to go now, feel free. Otherwise, if you'd like to stick around for discussion afterwards, that we'd greatly appreciate that as well. But the lecture and the event officially ends here. With that, I want to thank everyone who's still here for attending. And I want to say, keep updated on our website, see what's happening soon. This Saturday, we have a long conference on, global affairs, since it's about COVID-19 and the global south. We'll also be talking about different streams of politics, somewhat with some of our correspondents, and you can ask them any questions you may. We'll have a Belgian youth leader joining us. We'll have an expert from UNHCR joining us, and an expert from the WHO. So it should be an interesting morning rather. And also the week after that, we have our Dies Natalis, our annual Lustrum conference, and it'd be great if you're all there. Again, information on our website. Our Commissioner of Public Relations should post a link shortly, allowing you to find it easily. And yeah, I hope to see you all there. Otherwise, please feel free to stick around for the discussion now. And we'll just talk about what's being said tonight.